Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of Mormonism Live. I'm Radio Free Mormon, and that gentleman over there, that good-looking gentleman over there, that's Bill Reel. How are you doing tonight, Bill?
What a great time we're going to have tonight. I'm doing good, excited to talk to Dr. Murphy, and this is going to be a fun chance to go into his book. Yep. And have a great conversation.
Yes, incredible book, solid work of scholarship. I've read it, and I think it really makes a very, very palpable case for what it is that Dr. Murphy's talking about. Let's go ahead and bring him on, and I'm going to see if I can get the main thesis straight before we proceed any further. Here he is, the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Thomas Murphy. How are you doing?
I am doing quite well, RFM and Bill Reel. It's great to be back on Mormonism Live.
Well, it's great to have you back. I know the last time you were here, you had not yet had this book published, and you were giving out codes and things for people to get special deals from the University of Utah Press. But now it is definitely published. It's been out a couple of months now.
Yeah, it came out on Juneteenth, actually.
Okay. So June 19th.
Yeah.
We're now August. By the way, it is August 26, 2026. I think I neglected to mention that in the opening. So it's a couple of months. And, I have this book here. It's excellent. I see something in your frame. It's like over your shoulder, Tom. You have something similar in your...
I do indeed. And I have a copy here too as well.
Oh my gosh. This is great. It's fantastic. Can I ask you how it was that you chose this particular design for your book?
Well, I credit University of Utah Press for that. They asked me, did kind of an author's interview or questionnaire, I guess, about possible designs. And I gave them several photos that I thought would make a great background. And I also suggested using wampum as a background. And they went with the wampum idea. And so wampum is a beaded belt, in this case, that is used by Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people as a mnemonic device for recording information. So this is basically an Iroquois or Haudenosaunee form of writing represented here. That's a weaving of beads carved from a quahog or a shell, a clam shell. And so it is a great way of recording information and very important in the telling of the story. I also have represented on my t-shirt the Hiawatha belt, which is the story of the Great Peace. It's the recording of the Great Peace, which, as we'll see, is replicated in the Book of Mormon. This would be the original. Okay,
the original Book of Mormon.
No, the original Great Peace narrative, as it was recorded by Hiawatha, and represents the uniting of 5 nations together. And those 5 nations would be the Oneidas, the Oneidas, the Mohawks. Sorry, I'm saying it in the wrong order. Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, and Tuscaroras would later join. They'd be a 6th nation. So that representation is the original story of the peacemaker coming to Turtle Island, which is replicated in the Book of Mormon as Jesus visiting ancient America.
And he sure established a peace. I mean, it was 200 years long, wasn't it?
In the Book of Mormon, it's 200 years long. In David Cusick's Sketches of the Ancient History of the 6 Nations that was published in 1827, it's 100 years long. But Joseph Smith tends, as we'll see with his use of Haudenosaunee oral tradition, to exaggerate.
Yes, he can. Noah has 1 ark, and the Book of Mormon has 8 barges.
Right. Yeah. The same thing he does with the Bible. He does with Haudenosaunee oral tradition. Everything's just a little bit more miraculous, a little bit more grandiose, and it kind of outdoes all the other traditions he's borrowing from.
Well, thank you for explaining the answer to that question. I know that you and I had a lengthy phone conversation last night where we went into the weeds on a lot of issues, including the wampum. And you made me
Right.
promise not to do that tonight because you're going to go through your entire book, hitting a highlight, basically one highlight from each of your chapters in the book in order to give people a good overview. I've got a couple of questions, or at least one I want to make at the end, maybe some along the way. But first, let me see if I have the thesis correct of your book, which
Okay.
is this. I used to be an apologist for the church, so I totally get it when you talk about Book of Mormon apologists going 2,000 years ago and going through
Mhm.
the ruins and the manuscripts looking for evidence of the Book of Mormon amongst dead Native Americans. Whereas what you say is they're looking in the wrong place. They
Mhm.
should be looking
The
in
wrong
Joseph
time. Yeah.
and the wrong time. That they should be looking in Joseph Smith's neighborhood during Joseph Smith's lifetime, because that's where the source is for so many of these things we see in the Book of Mormon and in Mormon history.
Right. And I'm saying that this way of portraying the Book of Mormon as being a history of ancient America is a way of silencing the living in favor of giving voice to the dead. And so Joseph Smith is conjuring the dead through a seer stone and trying to access his understanding of the past through a divination technique that is actually one used by Haudenosaunee as well. And as he's trying to access those voices of the dead, he is silencing the living indigenous people who have actually shared their stories with him. At least that's the way they tell it, is that they shared these stories with Joseph Smith. And that's how the Haudenosaunee stories end up in the Book of Mormon.
Very good. Did you have anything you want to say, Bill? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. I just want to note that in Mormon apologetics, one of the games that we play is we go into, for instance, the Book of Mormon, and we look for, Dan Peterson and Lou Midgley and all of those guys. They look for slight evidence of a festival, or trying to sort of pinpoint, like, oh, look at the ancientness in the Book of Mormon. And I just want to applaud you for sort of turning that argument on its head and saying, like, what if the argument is stronger, that we could demonstrate that the Native American context that Joseph Smith would have had in his culture, that it actually is working in the more rational way, which is that Joseph Smith is hearing things about Native Americans in his own milieu, and he is then implementing that into the Book of Mormon. And I just want to say thank you for taking what I think is often weak, plausible apologetics and going, like, let's look at this from the 20,000 foot view in the order that it is more rational it happened, and see if the evidence actually fits better.
And can I add something?
It does. Yeah.
Yeah. And let me add this here, just because I was talking about this on the phone with Colby before the show started. All right. Which is this. I know that you in your book adduce a lot of evidence about the source for a lot of things, the context for the Book of Mormon being Joseph Smith's time and place. And the apologists have done the same in, 2,000 years ago, hither and yon. So regardless of, okay, let's say they're the same, okay? I don't know how you make that determination. I've got a feeling that how you come into it is going to determine how you're going to go out of it when it comes to that kind of determination. But let's just say the evidence was about equal on both sides. In other words, your evidence was about equal with theirs, all right? I'm not saying that's the case. But if it were, I think you still win in spades. And the reason is this, is that the Book of Mormon's claim to ancientness and everything that goes along with it, including Moroni, is extraordinary.
Right.
And an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence. Your claim, yes?
Go ahead.
Or,
Even the Book of Mormon itself acknowledges that it's as if the dead could speak, as if they could speak. The Book of Mormon, you could make an argument that the Book of Mormon itself supports a 19th century reading.
On the other hand, right? So what was the first hand? The first hand was about how even if it were even, that's an extraordinary claim. So it requires extraordinary evidence. Your claim, on the other hand, that the source or some of the sources is the context of Joseph Smith's day and place and the Native Americans in his area and what was going on, while ingenious, is not extraordinary. In fact, that's one of the brilliant things about it, is that's so obvious once you say it, right? Once you reveal it, it becomes obvious. It's like balancing the egg on the table or whatever it is. You break the end and set it up, and then everybody knows how. But nobody knows how until you show it. So that's the brilliant part. But I think that what that means is that even if the evidence were even, you win hands down because your claim is so much more ordinary that it doesn't require the extraordinary evidence that the Book of Mormon claim would require to establish it.
Right.
Any thoughts? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I think that it doesn't require miracles. And, so I also don't dismiss the possibility of inspiration or divinity or anything like that. I don't weigh in on those questions. It could be inspired. It could even be divine, but it's not miraculous in the way that the traditional story requires.
Okay. Well, great. Do you want to say anything before we get going on your slides?
Well, I do want to acknowledge that I'm living here in Western Washington, kind of south of you, RFM, in the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. And as the title of the book suggests, we're going to be talking about the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, or the traditional people of the lands from which the Book of Mormon itself emerged.
Great. Now, I'll put the slideshow up here on the stage. And are you still able to move those slides, Tom?
Well, let's try that. Sure can.
Great.
So I want to actually begin by reflecting back on your show last week, which I really enjoyed. The show, there were actually a couple of them that you addressed, first Zion's Camp and then the Zelf narrative. And in that, there was some discussion based on feedback between yourself and viewers about whether or not there was a lake. One of the Finger Lakes was at Onondaga. Yes. So I thought I'd start with a photograph of Onondaga Lake. And so we have here in evidence that in fact there is one of the Finger Lakes is Onondaga Lake, and it plays a very important role in the narratives that the Book of Mormon itself adopts. Here you can see.
Tom, can I ask you the question that I've already said is so important? I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, does the name of Onondaga Lake go back to Joseph Smith's time? Does it predate Joseph Smith?
Yeah, definitely predates that time.
Okay. Thank you.
And so when he's using that term Onondagas to describe the commander under which Zelf supposedly had served, it's an obvious reference to the Onondagas people and to the place of Onondaga, the central nation of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people.
To me, it almost seems. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bill.
No, go ahead, RFM.
Oh, I was just saying, to me, I get the feel from the way Joseph Smith describes it. We hear it through third parties, I know. But that Onondagas is not only the great prophet, but almost the progenitor of the people who are named after him. I know that's reading a bit into what he says, but I kind of get that sense. Bill?
It's kind of implied, yeah.
Yeah. And go ahead, Thomas. Sorry.
And I think to people in the 19th century, especially that are traveling from Ohio on their way to Missouri, these are people that are more familiar with that term Onondaga and would associate it with the Haudenosaunee, or the people they probably knew as Five Nations, Six Nations, or Iroquois. Haudenosaunee is the name they use for themselves. And so it would have been an obvious implication, just like the term Oneida appearing in the Book of Mormon is also a reference to one of the Six Nations.
Yeah. And on both of those, I get it. From the believing side, it's easy to like want to leap towards that being evidence that the Book of Mormon's true by going like, oh, there are these ancient words that were used with the Lamanites and Nephites a long, long time ago. And here is Joseph Smith referring to that. The other option, which, again, I think both of those words, Oneida and Onondaga, serve as sort of tangential evidence of the very points you're making in the book. And one has to stand back and go like, what's more rational? Is it more rational that Joseph Smith is a prophet and he's connecting to ancient terms and relating to an individual in Missouri when that term is seems to be more prominent when he goes further east where he actually lives, Joseph Smith?
Mm-hmm.
Is it more rational that he's doing a prophetic thing and connecting to a person who has a similar word some distance away? Or is it more reasonable or rational that Joseph Smith is hearing these narratives, seeing and hearing these words in his culture, and then using this as he puts Mormonism forth? And I think there's room to some degree to believe both sides, but one has to sort of go with like which direction makes more sense in light of all the evidence.
Right.
Tom, can I ask you a couple questions? It's about would you pronounce this? It's
Onondaga or Onondagas is
Onondagas
for the people.
Okay. So I'll try and pronounce it correctly. Onondagas. That's one of the 5 nations.
Yeah, one of the original 5 nations. It's the Central Nation, in fact. The Central Nation.
And Oneida?
Oneida is also one of the 5 nations.
And the 5 nations.
I've got a map that explains that in a couple of slides here.
But I'm just overwhelmed by the statistics here. It just so that 2 of the 5 nations, the names of 2 of the 5 nations that are there in Joseph Smith's, well, he's in their backyard.
Yeah.
Then they show up in the Book of Mormon, or actually only Oneida shows up in the Book of Mormon, but Onondagas shows up in the Zelph story.
Right. And in Joseph Smith's preaching about the Book of Mormon. So, yeah. So on the slideshow, you can see a picture of my wife and I at Onondaga Lake last October. And I want to show you some of the signage that you can go when you visit Onondaga Lake State Park, which I encourage people to do. You can see the interpretive signage that's been created in partnership with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and particularly with the Onondaga Nation. And you see on this sign that I've blown up a little bit for the slide there. Would one of you like to read what you see on that sign?
I can see the writing underneath. Is that good enough?
Yeah. The writing here. Yes.
Okay. Do you have that, Bill? Can you see that?
I can see both the sign if I put us at the bottom or the text underneath. And if they say the same thing, I can read them both.
Okay,
I'll be happy to. So Onondaga Lake is a sacred and historic place. And I don't know how to pronounce that word, but for the
Haudenosaunee,
over 1,000 years ago, the peacemaker brought together 5 warring nations: the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas formed an alliance based upon a great law of peace.
Right. And so here you have at Onondaga Lake a brief recounting of the great peace, the Haudenosaunee narrative that is the apogee, is kind of the climax of the Book of Mormon. And you have it told, instead of in the Book of Mormon version, you have it told in it's from a state monument, but it was created in consultation with the Onondaga people. And so it gives you a chance to see that indigenous perspective that is co-opted or culturally appropriated in the Book of Mormon, but here more represented, more in their own terms. And if we kind of flesh it out a little bit with a little more context, so the peacemaker in the Haudenosaunee oral traditions, travels throughout the Five Nations as part of his quest to bring them together. But he brings them together ultimately at Onondaga. And so Onondaga Lake it plays a key role in that Great Peace narrative. It is the central location. It's kind of like the equivalent, if we take the Book of Mormon's representation of the Great Peace, you've got Jesus visiting Bountiful in ancient America. This Onondaga is like the equivalent of Bountiful in their stories. So it's that central place that the peacemaker is doing the great work of uniting the nations. So Onondaga is central to the story, both the Haudenosaunee story and the story as it's represented or misrepresented in the Book of Mormon. And for those who aren't familiar with Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people, I've got a map here to kind of orient folks. So again, the term Iroquois is the French term for the 5 or 6 nations, as they were called by the English. The 5 nations originally, joined by the Tuscaroras in the 18th century, who originally came from down by North Carolina, but they were relatives of the Haudenosaunee people speaking a similar language. And during the colonial conflicts there, they took refuge among the 5 nations and became ultimately a 6th nation. There were quite a number of tribes from the east that did take refuge among the Haudenosaunee. And some of them, as we'll see, 7 Algonquian nations that took refuge at Oneida are represented in the Book of Mormon as 7 Lamanite towns also taking refuge at Oneida in the Book of Mormon. So Tuscarora have a similar role there. If you look at it on the map of Western or upstate New York, you have the Mohawk Nation on the eastern door, then the Oneidas as the next nation going to the west, the Onondagas in the center part. That's where the council fire is held, where the 5 nations come together. Then you have the Cayugas and the Senecas, and the Senecas are in the territories that Palmyra, their territory includes Palmyra and Manchester. And Senecas and Cayugas in particular were very active in the Palmyra, Manchester area in the 1810s and 1820s when the Smith family is living there. And so they're having those interactions with Cayugas and Senecas there. And then down to the south along the Susquehanna River, Oneidas and Mohawks are much more prominent in that area. And a fair number of Tuscaroras as well are on the Susquehanna River when Joseph Smith is digging for treasure there again in the 1820s. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the kind of the spheres of interaction between the Smith family and the Haudenosaunee people. And there's also another area of interaction that's pretty important because it was like a missionary training ground for missions to the Haudenosaunee people. And this was a school in New Hampshire called Moores Indian Charity School. And that was part of Dartmouth College. And this would be a training ground where people would learn the languages, the Haudenosaunee languages, as well as some Algonquian languages as well, and learn how to be effective missionaries, and then come and serve as missionaries in this territory. And so there was a lot of exchange between Haudenosaunee communities and Moores Indian Charity School. So the interactions with the Smith family would go back into the early 1810s, where Joseph Smith's brother Hiram attended Moores Indian Charity School, and he had a number of Seneca and Mohawk classmates and some Algonquian classmates as well that he would have interacted with and may very well have heard some of these stories that we'll see replicated in the Book of Mormon.
I want to ask one other question about the Zelf episode, and then I'll try my best not to go off on tangents. But does it again, I get anything is possible. You know, whatever we can't prove absolutely couldn't have happened. There's always the possibility it did. But does it make any rational sense that Onondaga, that word for a person, would show up as far west as Missouri? And does it make any sense that Oneida would show up in Central America?
Okay, great question. Yeah, so actually the Zelf incident occurred in Western Illinois. So let's clarify that. So reframe that question is would Onondagas have had influence in Western Illinois? Probably not anciently, okay, but in the 18th and 19th century, certainly, because the Haudenosaunee people were key to the fur trade, and so they played central roles in the fur trade as the fur traders are going further west. And so they were traveling to the Rocky Mountains and back to the Eastern Shore, or the East Sea, right? The Haudenosaunee were traveling back and forth as fur traders because they were the primary employees of the major fur trading companies, one of which was owned by Solomon Mack, and who was, by Stephen Mack, who was Stephen Mack Sr., who was Lucy Mack's brother, or Joseph Smith's uncle, was the owner of one of those, at that time, one of the largest fur trading companies that one was centered in the Detroit, Michigan area.
But not in Book of Mormon times.
You're right. So this is the 18th, 19th century. And so in that time frame, yes, that extension was very prominent, but not anciently, because this is something that came out of the colonial encounters and came out of the fur trade, which really got its start in the 17th, 18th centuries,
So Joseph Smith's Zelf story about the influence of Onondagas.
Onondagas.
Thank you. The prophet, as far out from New York as Western Illinois, is something that reflects the influence that Native Americans could have had in Joseph Smith's day, but not in the Book of Mormon.
Right, not in the times of the Book of Mormon. Exactly.
And then Oneida, I assume the same thing. We wouldn't find that culture in Book of Mormon times as far south as the Guatemalan Peninsula.
No, and so there's the Haudenosaunee kind of sphere of influence does not extend to Central America. Although there are some interesting intersections. Haudenosaunee oral tradition says that the Spanish were the first Europeans that they encountered, so they would have had interactions with the Spanish. Again, this is during the colonial period, and also a lot of the stories that the Spanish friars collected from Aztecs and Mayans and even Peruvians, they made their way up into what is now the United States and Canada, or within the British Empire and the French Empire, especially. And so especially the French missionaries that predated a lot of the Protestant missionaries in Haudenosaunee territory, they were intimately familiar with and read the writings of the Catholic missionaries that were in Central and South America. So and so they were aware of Quetzalcoatl stories and things like that, and wrote about them. And so there would have been, during the colonial period, an influx of Mesoamerican, Central American ideas into Haudenosaunee territory as well. So again, during the colonial period, yes, but the influence was coming from the south up into Haudenosaunee territory. Although I should say that in the just like the French missionaries were reading the writings of the Spanish missionaries were reading the writings of the French missionaries too, although those came a little bit later, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I will step away. Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's go back to the slides here. And so the argument I make in the book is framed here. And I'll read it here. The Book of Mormon envisioned a shadow world refracting and obscuring a 19th century settler colonial society and its indigenous rivals, and projected these societal divisions back into the ancient past. So essentially, I'm arguing the Book of Mormon is really about its the recent history, and not about ancient America. But it's taking Joseph Smith's experiences, those of his family, those of people he had heard stories from, and projecting those back into the past as if they had happened anciently rather than recently. And if I can read this, I'll read the second part to this argument is, in my reading as advanced herein, the Book of Mormon constructs an ancient society as a mirror that reflects and refracts an 18th and 19th century settler colonial society. The indigenous peoples and narratives most akin to those in the Book of Mormon are not found among the ancient dead, as proposed in the as represented in the archaeological record. Instead, they can be found among Joseph Smith's living Algonquian and Iroquoian neighbors, particularly those with close ties to Moores Indian Charity School at Dartmouth College, as well as the Senecas, Mohawks, and Oneidas who lived in the vicinity of the Smith family's treasure-seeking activities.
Wow, I can't help but notice that you're focusing in on the same place that Randy Bell is, Moores Indian Charity School at Dartmouth College.
Yeah, both of us have been influenced by the author Richard Behrens.
I noted you referenced him a number of times in your book.
Yeah, both of us have drawn from his research, and I think it's been formative. It's published in the Journal of John Whitmer Historical Association, and I tried to extend beyond his work into a much larger body of literature than Richard Behrens looked at, but it does provide some support for some of his conclusions. Although Richard Behrens sometimes tried to put too much maybe on the Dartmouth influence, and Dan Vogel in particular encourages me to approach it with some caution. And so I do think it's both Randy Bell and I have been influenced by that, but I certainly approach his work, Richard Behrens' work, critically, and encourage Randy to do the same. But I do think it's valuable for those that want to get a better sense of what's going on. And the reason that I emphasize it, I should say, isn't because of Richard Behrens so much as when I'm looking at these variants of the Haudenosaunee oral tradition, what's beautiful about oral tradition is that it's varied. It's not all the same. So you have different versions of the stories. And so which of those versions of the stories are most similar to those that are found in the Book of Mormon? And what I have found is that those variants that are most similar to the Book of Mormon tie into that social network connected to Moores Indian Charity School. And so rather than say versions recorded by French Jesuit missionaries, or it's the ones that are in that closest interaction with the Smith family, those are the ones that make it into the Book of Mormon. And so that's why I'm placing the emphasis on it, as well as, of course, the evidence from Dartmouth College itself, of the attendance records at Moores Indian Charity School that show Joseph Smith in taking classes with Seneca and Mohawk and Algonquian classmates.
I know you mean Hiram Smith there, right?
Sorry, did I? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, when we're live like this, I always, find some little slip up there.
I usually see it in myself afterward when I'm watching the live chat, and I can't do anything about it. Here's what I thought about this is that, I've studied Mormon history as much as the next guy. Mm-hmm. And when I study it and read it, it never occurred to me, there's no Native Americans in it. It's as if all the early instances and events of church history happened. There's not a Native American within 1 million miles of there. And yet you spend a number of pages documenting. You make that observation yourself, but you document how, yeah, there are Native Americans everywhere, including at Moore's Charity School and all these other places. And you document to show, yes, there's all this intermingling in society, marriages, all sorts of things going on. And why wouldn't you think that the culture and the stories would also transfer over?
Right. And, you know, it's amazing the degree to which Native people have been written out of Mormon history. But that's true of American history more generally. Okay. And so there certainly is an effort now to go back and recover those stories. And fortunately, they're in the records, right? They're in the attendance records, they're in the newspapers, they're in the local histories. It's just that historians have overlooked them. And so I'm going back and re-looking at those records, and sure enough, there are indigenous people, as they said, they were present in the founding communities of Mormonism, and they had interactions with the Smith family and the Mack family.
And you found out something about, was it your great-great-grandmother and some unlikely coincidence connection she has in Mormon history?
Well, it's possible that my great-great-grandmother, or multiple greats, be 7 generations ago from me, Susanna Ferguson, lived in the community of Otago. And Otago, as I was going through the local histories there, I found references to Joseph Smith living in Otago, which was a surprise because you don't see that in any of the biographies of Joseph Smith. But it's in the local histories. And so that led me to dig a little deeper and corresponded a bit with Dan Vogel about this, and found a home. It's now called the Otson Home in Otago, that used to be the Yeoman's Tavern. And so Dan Vogel had identified Yeoman's Tavern as over, I think, in Windsor, rather than in Otago. But now we know that, in fact, Yeoman's Tavern was in Otago, which is further to the east of Windsor and, say, Binghamton, New York. It's kind of to the east of that if you follow the Susquehanna River towards its source.
And Susanna Ferguson?
Yeah, so she lived in that same community, and there was a Sarah Ferguson that was in that same home. I wasn't able to establish whether they were related or not, so I don't know for sure that that Sarah and Susanna are related, but they share a common last name, and so it's at least hypothetically possible that my family might have interacted with Joseph Smith. And I should say that a little bit more about that family. So Susanna Ferguson is the person that we were raised with stories about her being an Indian princess in our family tree. Now that term today, I don't like that term. It's inaccurate misrepresentation of Haudenosaunee society. But the records that I found indicate that she likely descended from some captives that were taken captive from Cherry Valley, not very far away from Otago, New York, and taken captive during the Revolutionary War, and that one of her parents may very well have been a baby who was born during the war, as the product of a Mohawk man and a woman by the name of Mary Manton, who was taken captive. And then her father was likely Thomas Ferguson, who was taken captive from Cherry Valley. So he lived in Mohawk communities for 7 years, learned the language, and came to see himself as Mohawk before he was returned to his family, and had to relearn his English language and culture, and so. According to our family histories, they saw themselves very much as indigenous, and so that's a big part of the book as well that I share.
Yeah, it was a fascinating part. Sorry if I took you off your topic.
Well, that's all right. It's a fun part, and when I didn't have emphasized in these slides, but that's fine. What it is the what part that led me into exploring these questions. I wanted to understand my own family history better, and so I kept encountering all these Haudenosaunee stories as I was trying to understand my own family that looked a lot like the stories I saw in the Book of Mormon, and so I wanted to understand where did they come from. And of course, Haudenosaunee people have stories of their own about how Mormons came to be. And in those stories, it's always living indigenous people who shared their traditions with Joseph Smith. And those stories range from Joseph Smith stealing the tablets, as they usually call them, or a collaborative production of the tablets, or Joseph Smith just hearing the stories, borrowing the stories. And so you have this range of framings that you see in Haudenosaunee tradition that explain the similarities between the Book of Mormon and their traditions. But together, they represent a form of cultural appropriation. And so this is from the back of the book is the endorsement from Darren Bonaparte, who is a leading Mohawk scholar. Many people may have seen him in the recent PBS series on the American Revolution, where he was featured prominently. And what he says is in what will certainly be one of the most provocative and shocking books to mention the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, Thomas W. Murphy delves into the most infamous case of cultural appropriation that ever took place, the revelations recorded by Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon. Murphy goes beyond the similarities to the visions of Handsome Lake, a late 18th century Seneca prophet, and suggests the stories Smith told about the kingmen and freemen were actually about how the American Revolution unfolded in Iroquois. Many of us have wondered about what inspired Smith, but Murphy is the first scholar to really go there. And what I want, the reason for quoting this is I am amplifying Haudenosaunee perspectives on the Book of Mormon that are often overlooked. And somehow we think it's okay for us to tell stories as Mormons about how American Indians came to be, but we don't stop and listen to Haudenosaunee stories about how Mormons came to be. And in those stories, Joseph Smith is culturally appropriating or misappropriating the Haudenosaunee traditions and translating them into something that is sometimes offensive to the indigenous peoples.
I understand that what you're talking about are stories that go the other way, and I know that you spent some time on it, maybe in chapter 2, but it's not something you want to commit yourself to, but also you feel like you can't let it go without mentioning it. And that has to do with the idea that Joseph Smith either got taught this by the Iroquois Indians or stole it or something like that, but that these are stories that are coming from the Native Americans.
At least some of them.
Okay, so some of those stories are coming from the Native Americans themselves.
And being reframed. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so here's what I want to ask you. I get why Mormons would do that all day long, why they would tell those stories. But if those stories now are coming from Native Americans who are not Mormon, I'm presuming, does that not indicate the fact that they can see the connections between the Book of Mormon and their own stories and legends as well?
They definitely see the connections. Yeah. It's interesting when I'm, presenting at the conference on Iroquois research and stuff. It seems in Mormon communities, there is a big question. Did Joseph Smith really get these stories from the Iroquois? It really, and it's a big question. It's not a question there. So when I'm presenting there, it's taken for granted. It's like, of course he did. Of course he took our stories. And so it's so apparent to them that, that there's no reason to even question it. And each time I present, somebody else comes forward to me with, oh, have you heard this story? Or let me tell you the story about what really happened. And I'd hear a different variant of these traditions.
Does the fact that the Book of Mormon is itself written to the Native Americans, might that account for Joseph Smith including some of their stories and legends in the book itself to appeal to them?
Oh yeah, I think he's doing it in the same way he's kind of referencing the Bible as a kind of a sense of authority. So he's echoing and alluding to biblical stories. He's also echoing and alluding to Haudenosaunee stories in a way that I think would resonate with his 19th century audience, and that I think he hoped for a much greater reception of the Book of Mormon in indigenous communities. And in fact, there's indications in the Book of Mormon itself that he anticipated a parallel prophet, an indigenous prophet, to that he might work alongside of, and that might very well have been Tenskwatawa. Sorry, I mispronounced that. Tenskwatawa, who was a Shawnee prophet who lived in Indian Territory, where Joseph Smith sent his first missionaries. So it's very likely he had hopes of converting Tenskwatawa to the Book of Mormon and having a counterpart to help him. And Tenskwatawa, for those who are not familiar with him, is Tecumseh's brother, who played such a key role in the War of 1812. So this is while Joseph Smith was a child. He was, very prominent throughout throughout all the discussions of the War of 1812. Well, his brother, the prophet, had been somewhat discredited among his own people because his prophecies of conquering the Americans didn't come true. But he was still present, still, being interviewed by people, being visited. And I suspect that Joseph Smith had aspirations of converting him or someone like him to be a counterpart, a role that Sidney Rigdon ultimately would end up playing rather than an indigenous prophet.
Right. And so everybody knows in 2 Nephi chapter 3, in that passage where we're having this recounting of some kind of blessing from Joseph, of old Joseph in Egypt, where it talks about, that there's going to be a seer who's going to come out of the fruit of my loins. And it says the fruit of my loins about 1 million times.
Yeah.
But it says that Joseph's going to have a descendant. His name will be Joseph. It'll be named after his father and all this stuff. And we all see this as transparent reference to Joseph Smith. Well, in the early church and up at, for the first 100 years, I guess, that was not how it was seen. It was seen as a prophecy of a Native American who would come forward and be the second person with Joseph Smith.
Well, yeah, there's different interpretations. So the one that's usually referred to as the Indian prophet is the one mighty among them, and that's sometimes seen or often seen as separate from the Joseph the seer. So they're seen more as parallel.
Right, and the reason I bring it up is I was surprised in a later edition. I can't remember which one it was. It was one with the Orson Pratt footnotes and where he breaks it down into verses.
1879. Yes.
Thank you. Where he includes the footnote there in 2 Nephi 3 and talks about it at, I think he says, an Indian prophet or something.
Indeed. Right. Yeah. And so I think that's what, Joseph Smith had originally imagined, and actually what the Book of Mormon prophesies, but that's not what happened. So
it fell completely flat with the Native Americans.
Yeah. Well, and even when you go through my book and see the degree to which he that his theology of whiteness just pervades every reference, or nearly every reference he's making to Haudenosaunee oral traditions. He's also whitening the narrative, emphasizing a theology of whiteness that I think is hard for Native people to swallow, then as well as today. So what I wanted to do now is go through some highlights of the book. And first I want to introduce you to the contents. And so you see on the screen an outline of the table of contents from the book. And we'll go through the 10 chapters one by one and pull out a highlight from each chapter. There's a lot more in these chapters than I'll have time to highlight, but it give you at least a taste of what you can expect throughout the book.
This is how you were so sure about where the Zelf Mound was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, I begin with my prologue telling the story of me working in an archaeological site not very far from where, the Zelf Mound was. We were on the other side of the Mississippi River from where Zion's camp had stopped and robbed an indigenous mound. But I begin with my experiences at this archaeological field school, where in that plot you can see on the screen, I accidentally uncovered a human bone and forgot to, or didn't recognize it as such, and did not report it to my professor. And so that created a big lecture that she gave us on the ethics of archaeology. And that was the first recognition for me that it might not be appropriate to dig up human remains for the purpose of validating a scripture or producing a scripture like the Book of Mormon. Because in that lecture about the ethics of archaeology, she pointed out that, just like we wouldn't want somebody to dig up a cemetery with our grandparents in it, that archaeologists, ethical archaeologists today, work in collaboration with indigenous communities, seek and consult with them before digging up anything resembling a cemetery. And so there are protocols put in place legally, as well as ethically, that provide Native people with a say about what happens to their descendants or their ancestors, and whether or not they can be dug up. And in this case, what we did is we stopped excavating in that area because we might very well find more human remains, and moved to another plot where we began another excavation unit. But for me, it was a very important lesson that helped shape much of my career, because I've worked with indigenous scholars such as my colleague Angela Baca, who is Hopi and Navajo or Dene. And we've written a number of articles together about repatriation issues and their relationship to the Book of Mormon. So you'll see an influence of that in the book. But I'm also making a big historical argument that actually we're going to gain more from collaborating with indigenous people and working with them than we ever will from digging up their relics, their remains, their archaeological sites. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, my understanding is that lots of the relics are buried with people, interred with them, and I was wondering how you balance that.
Yeah, well, in an archaeological site, you don't target the burials, because they aren't necessarily going to be that informative anyway, for if you want to understand how people are living their everyday lives, that sort of thing. And there would be times that maybe a burial would be excavated, but that decision would be made in collaboration with the descendants. Just like you might need to move a cemetery for a highway, or maybe move a highway so you don't impact a cemetery. Those sort of discussions need to occur before you begin the excavation. And in this case, there were known mounds on this farm, but the excavation was targeted away from the mounds because we weren't wanting to find the human remains, and inadvertently we did. But then the protocol that they had lined out was that we would move away from that area, decrease the likelihood. And again, the scientific knowledge to be gained is actually better outside of the burials.
Forgive me for asking, do police get involved at any step along the way to make sure it's not a crime victim?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I don't know what exactly happened in the back room of this particular site, but I've supervised archaeological sites of my own. And so what we've done when we've encountered bones that we thought might potentially be human bones, we notify immediately the biological anthropologist, and then try to determine at the state level, and try to determine if, by sending pictures and stuff, that could this potentially be a human bone. And in our case, in the archaeological sites that I've done, we did not. It wasn't a human bone; it was an animal bone. But in the cases that human bones are encountered, it's going to depend on that context. If it's obvious ancient burial, then the law enforcement might not be involved. But if it's, let's say you're coming on a site and you encounter these human remains on the surface, then law enforcement would be called right away.
Thank you.
So let's start with the beginning chapter, Oneida. The first chapter features the place name Oneida. And as we've already hinted, that this place name appears 3 times in the Book of Mormon. It's spelled a little bit differently, but it's spelled one time as Onidah, and then the other 2 times it's spelled as Oneidah. So there's an H added to the end. In the current edition, that's in the original manuscripts, and then in the current edition of the Book of Mormon, they're all 3 spelled as Onidah. And Oneida is not only one of the 6 nations as a reference, just kind of in that general sense that Onondagas is a reference to the Onondagas people, but Oneida is also associated with a series of characters in Haudenosaunee communities. And in the chapter, I discuss 9 characters that in the Book of Mormon that resemble historical characters, primarily from the 18th century during the Revolutionary War. And these characters sometimes have similar names, they have similar biographies, and act in similar roles within a larger conflict between freemen and kingmen that I see as an allegorical reenactment of the Revolutionary War. It's framed in the book itself as types and shadows, and so maybe a believer might see it more as types and shadows, so that kind of an idea of that history repeats itself, so that there are similar characters in the past to people in the present. And of course, you in Mormonism Live have highlighted the similarities between George Washington and Captain Moroni in some of your previous episodes. That's one of those 9 characters I look at. But I want to focus as the highlight here on 3 of those. 3 of those characters that are most closely associated with that place name of Oneida. And this is the character in the Book of Mormon known as Amalickiah, who is a Nephite who becomes a Lamanite king. And his story is very reminiscent of Sir William Johnson, an Irishman who becomes a Mohawk sachem. So he takes on a political leadership role within Mohawk communities through his marriage to Molly Brant. Molly Brant was a Mohawk clan mother and a prominent family. And it's through his marriage to her that he is elevated into or elected to a leadership role in the community. And so you have this peculiar situation of a settler person who becomes an indigenous leader. And so you have that replicated in both accounts. Sir William Johnson being very much like Amalickiah. You have a Lamanite queen that Amalickiah marries that's very much like Molly Brant. What's interesting is that the Book of Mormon presents this as if it were a patriarchal society rather than a matrilineal society. So Mohawk communities are matrilineal. That is, leadership is passed down through the clan mothers. The clan mothers are the ones who elect the sachems. So by marrying a Lamanite queen in a patriarchal society wouldn't make a king out of you. That's only happens in a matrilineal society or a matriarchal society. And so the story is kind of fudging its details in order to reflect that more recent context, that type and shadow. And Amalickiah, just like Sir William Johnson, ends up dying after some significant battles, but before what would be that battle between the Kingmen and the Freemen, or the Revolutionary War. So Sir William Johnson had become famous and received his baronetcy during the French and Indian War. And at that time, he served, at that time, Solomon Mack, who was Joseph Smith's grandfather, served under Sir William Johnson during the French and Indian War. And in that war, Solomon Mack was present at the very same battle that Sir William Johnson became famous for, and basically turned the tide in the French and Indian War to the British side, and helped win the war.
So it's pretty darn likely Joseph Smith Jr. would have been aware of this story.
Absolutely. Well, it's in his grandfather's book.
Yeah.
So, his grandfather wrote a book and talks about this. So he most definitely would have known about Sir William Johnson. And I would say it's fair to assume that pretty much everybody would have known about him, just like everybody knows who Donald Trump is today. I mean, he was that prominent of a figure. And so Sir William Johnson, just like Amalickiah, ends up dying between the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War, just on the eve of the Revolutionary War. In the Book of Mormon, it's represented as a murder. And although there were allegations of murder during the Revolutionary War, it was much more likely was a dying of a natural cause. Was it a spear to the heart is what I want to know. Only metaphorically. But you do have them dying similarly, or at least at a similar time, a little bit different context. Like I say, every time I find these similar stories, the Book of Mormon is just it's not a replication exactly of the indigenous story. It exaggerates or makes it more. It's a better story, maybe. It's a storyteller's story, right? It's more elaborate, right? Yes, and to the extent that Joseph Smith was using these stories, we don't have to expect that he knew everything about all of them, that he had historical perfection on what they contained. He probably had mistakes that in his understanding, and those may have gotten incorporated as well. Right, and that may have been the way he heard the stories too, right? And so after Amalickiah dies, then it's Amaron in the Book of Mormon who comes to a leadership role, and he ends up leading the Lamanite faction that's working with the Kingmen, and that is a parallel to Molly's brother, Joseph Brant. In the Book of Mormon, it's brother rather. It's Amalickiah's brother rather than Molly's brother, or the Lamanite queen's brother. So there are slight differences, but again, very clearly, Joseph Brant is the analog to Amaron, who then goes on to lead significant battles, engages in some dialogue with Captain Moroni, and through letters exchanged, and that sort of thing. So it's one of the highlights of this chapter is to show that the Book of Mormon is retelling the story of the Revolutionary War by projecting it into the ancient past, and that the place name Oneida is super significant in this. And I should add a little bit, I guess, to explain why Oneida is so important here, is because when the Revolutionary War started, the Haudenosaunee nations were trying to decide, just like Amalickiah in his negotiation in the Book of Mormon, were trying to decide, should they ally with the Kingmen or the Freemen? And so the nations the 6 nations end up splitting, with primarily the Senecas and the Mohawks, and some of the Onondagas fighting on the side of the British, and primarily the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras and those Algonquian communities that had come to live at Oneida going to fight on the side of the freemen. And so you have that similar discussion occurring in the Book of Mormon, and the people from Oneida end up fighting with the freemen, just like the Oneidas do. And one of the kind of questions that I had, like, why is it that the Book of Mormon would emphasize these stories from the Revolutionary War versus, say, the War of 1812, which was much more recent, right? And as I dug in deeper, I realized that in 1825, a French nobleman by the name of the Marquis de Lafayette, who was similar to the Book of Mormon character Antipas, had toured Western New York, going up and down the Erie Canal, and had been celebrating his Oneida allies. So very much present in the 1820s Western New York was a retelling of the Revolutionary War and the role of the Oneidas in that Revolutionary War. And so just like in the actual Revolutionary War, the Oneidas of the Book of Mormon side with the freemen, and the Oneida, actual Oneida nation, sides with the patriots in the Revolutionary War. And so it's kind of a fascinating retelling that you find in the Book of Mormon.
That is interesting.
I can't go on this long on all these highlights, or we'll never get through them all. So chapter 2, I call that chapter Neophytes. And I use the term neophyte as kind of a play on words. Kind of neophyte and Nephite are very similar. And so it is a play on words. And of course, RFM and Bill will remember me coming on early in my research as I was starting to put some of the stuff together when I was first starting to write the book. And I did a segment on Mormonism Live called Neophytes and Lamanites. And that was going to be part of the title of the book at the time. The title evolved, and I was less enamored with the term neophyte over time, but it is kind of a fun play on words. And that the point I was trying to make is that neophytes are a better analog for Nephites than the ancient Hopewells, Adinas that are in the Heartland model of the Book of Mormon, or the Mayans and Olmecs that are emphasized in the Mesoamerican model of the Book of Mormon. And so that these neophytes are much better models. And one of the ways that I make that case in chapter 2 is by looking at the technology, the plants and animals that are associated with the Nephites in the Book of Mormon. The Nephites are depicted in the Book of Mormon raising European crops and domestic animals, things like wheat, barley, and oats, and sheep, cattle, and goats, and are represented using iron and steel and copper and brass, and using these European technologies. Copper actually was an indigenous technology, the use of copper, but not brass and steel. And the problem with that representation of the Nephites that way is that wasn't the way ancient America was. That indigenous people did not have any of those domestic animals that you see depicted in the Book of Mormon, and most of the domestic crops. I mean, the Book of Mormon does mention corn, which was a domestic crop, but the rest of the domestic crops mentioned in the Book of Mormon are not present in ancient America. But they were very much present in 18th and 19th century neophyte communities. And importantly, if we recognize that Joseph Smith was a treasure hunter before he became a prophet, he was digging for treasure in the Susquehanna Valley, where these Oneida and Mohawk communities had fully integrated European technologies, plants and animals into their society. So he would have likely been encountering iron, steel, silver, gold, brass artifacts. He would have been encountering the bones of domesticated animals, and perhaps even evidence of their crops. In his treasure seeking activities, And not only that, in Moore's Indian Charity School and the way that they taught missionary work at that time, to be civilized was to raise these European domestic plants and animals. And so you get this very much a 19th century worldview represented in the Book of Mormon, and a 18th and 19th century material culture that Joseph Smith would have encountered through his treasure seeking, but confused it with a more ancient past. Or maybe he maybe just projecting that into the ancient past was good for storytelling. You know, that may have been how it first started out. It was just great ways to tell stories, and over time he starts to believe those stories, and then sees his divination practices, where he's sticking his head in a hat and a seer stone, and seeing through a seer stone, he starts to produce these stories that are based on his own experiences.
Tom, have you defined what a neophyte is?
Oh, good question.
Because it's a convert. It's what.
Right. Neophyte. I did not. I don't think I said it. So a neophyte is a term that was used in the 19th century, still used today, but not very common. Used as a term for Christian converts, native converts to Christianity. Excuse me. And so native converts to Christianity were called neophytes. And I also use it in reference to the followers of Handsome Lake, or indigenous prophets. They were also called neophytes, in that they were followers of a new religious movement. And so it's kind of a play on words, but a way of emphasizing that it's living indigenous people rather than the ancient dead that most closely resemble those in the Book of Mormon.
Great. Thank you.
Chapter 3 is titled Visions. And what chapter 3 does is provide some of the context for Mormon readers, especially, that are not familiar with the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake, who is in Haudenosaunee oral tradition associated with the Joseph Smith movement. So one of the key similarities that is emphasized in Haudenosaunee stories about how Mormons came to be is that there's a resemblance between the stories in the Book of Mormon and the Code of Handsome Lake. And so Handsome Lake was a Seneca prophet living not far from that Palmyra, Rochester area in 1799 and 1800, who had a series of visions on the Genesee River. And so he had, in these visions, he had been incapacitated for a long period, and then arises from that incapacitation to share the stories of traveling to like the heaven and hell, and having visions of what was happening in these places. And he was led in that in his visions by three messengers, or sometimes called three angels. And these three messengers told him that a fourth messenger would eventually visit, and he would in a later vision. And they guided him through encounters with a lot of the same imagery that you see, or similar imagery to what you see in the Lehi vision. So significant buildings, plants playing key roles. So it has some of the symbolism and similarities of, I would say, general Second Great Awakening visions, of which I would put not just Handsome Lake's vision, but that of Joseph Smith's father, Joseph Smith Sr., and Lehi in the Book of Mormon, you have these visions that are reflecting a particular moment in Protestant Christianity that we call the Second Great Awakening. And so that chapter 3 takes you through those visions, some of the similarities and some of the differences that we see with Joseph Smith and his vision, or his father's visions, and those visions of Lehi and Nephi in the Book of Mormon. And also explore the way that Handsome Lake is represented in the Book of Mormon as akin to King Lamoni, and his half-brother corn planter is akin to the king anti-Nephi Lehi, also from the Book of Mormon. And so you have these characters in the Book of Mormon that having similar experiences to what Handsome Lake had. And so it kind of digs into that story and provides the context for Mormons to better understand why Haudenosaunee readers of the Book of Mormon say, this looks an awful lot like Handsome Lake's visions.
So maybe Joseph Smith with the 3 Nephites was doing a backstory for Handsome Lake's 3 messengers.
Right. Yeah. And, that kind of an etiology or an origin story for where they came from. And I'll get to that a little bit later in a later slide. Okay. So the chapter 4 is called Prophets. And this kind of steps back not just to the Seneca prophet, Handsome Lake, but brings in other earlier and later prophets. Neolin in the 1750s, and Wangaman, or 1760s for Neolin, 1750s for Wangaman. These are prophets that are very active in the Susquehanna Valley, a couple of generations before Joseph Smith is there hunting for treasure, and would have a significant impact on kind of popular understanding of indigenous prophets, of Indian prophets. Also, Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet, the one that I think Joseph Smith may very well have been targeting with those earliest missionary efforts. Tenskwatawa being the Shawnee prophet who played a key role in the War of 1812. Well, what we see is that are a lot of similarities between the prophetic teachings of these prophets and the Book of Mormon. One of the reasons is that these prophets did incorporate a lot of Christian symbolism into their visions, experiences. They began to see the world as divided between colonists and whites, and they began to see kind of more of a racialized view of the world, seeing all indigenous people as more closely related to each other than the colonists. And you see that bifurcation in the Book of Mormon when you have Nephites versus Lamanites. And so you that kind of framework of viewing the world is a byproduct of a certain time and place, the 18th century colonial experience in the Americas is where that idea develops. It's also where the idea of a great spirit develops as an English term to describe the indigenous understandings of the great mystery or the great power, the creator, or spiritual power. And so you get this period of the prophetic movements that begins to shape the kind of cultural context of the Book of Mormon. It also gets not just that broad context, but in the specific context of the way that Joseph Smith would try to understand the ancient world. And what we see is that Joseph Smith begins to imitate indigenous practices. And now he wasn't doing this alone. This was a broader Christian activity in the Americas. And you see it emerging in debates in American religion that would be important for Mormonism, and that is the idea that that miracles or gifts of the Spirit were something of the past, the ancient past. They were the time of the Bible, not of the present. But these Christians who had been taught to think, especially under the growth of the Enlightenment, to think kind of in a more secular worldview, that these gifts of the Spirit were a thing of the past rather than the present. And then they're interacting with all these natives who are having visions. They're having direct encounters with divinity, the Great Spirit, or whatever they want, using to call that those divine powers. So there's the way it's framed in the Book of Mormon is the indigenous people have a greater witness of even the Christianized ones are having visions of Jesus. So settlers begin to imitate the indigenous people, and they start to go on vision quests. There's a big revival at Moore's Indian Charity School that where people are imitating these vision quests, and it's then that Joseph Sr. and Joseph's mother, Lucy Mack, they go on their own vision quests. And of course, Joseph Smith going to the woods to seek a vision was also a replication of indigenous vision quests. And so you have this larger American context where the first and second Great Awakening are in part an effort by European Christians to imitate indigenous peoples. And among those imitations were taking indigenous practices and associating them with biblical practices and then replicating them. And you see this in a couple of key instances in Joseph Smith's life. One is during his treasure-seeking activities in the Susquehanna Valley, he's imitating a very famous practice that was being engaged in by Haudenosaunee people. It's called a white dog sacrifice. People were really interested in that because they thought maybe it resembled some biblical practices, because the white dog was said not to have to be a pure white dog, not to have any blemishes, and so they thought it was similar to a scapegoat in sacrificing a sheep without any blemishes in biblical passages, and so there was this fascination with these white dog sacrifices. So when Joseph Smith is interacting in the Susquehanna Valley with indigenous people, he's following this straggling Indian trying to locate some lost treasure, and then he, in order to try to access that treasure, he replicates or tries to replicate a white dog ceremony. He ends up substituting a sheep for the white dog because he couldn't find a pure white dog. Of course, he doesn't find any treasure. But the chapter explores that similarity between those white dog sacrifices in his treasure seeking and the Haudenosaunee traditions he's replicating. Also, another key thing is that the Christian traders and missionaries are encountering indigenous people who have these seeing stones, these translucent stones often, not only translucent, but these exotic stones that were often put in leather bags. They were part of a medicine bag and used for divination purposes by indigenous peoples. And so the settlers start seeing these as akin to an Urim and Thummim in the Bible, as a way of seeing that could generate revelation and could generate direct access to the divine outside of the Bible. And so Joseph Smith's use of a seer stone, placing that seer stone in a hat, is replicating these practices of indigenous holy men and prophets such as Handsome Lake. Handsome Lake, in his case, when he's engaging in these divinations, he's taking objects and placing them underneath a skin. And so that by placing it underneath the skin and excluding the light, he'll meditate on that object, and then emerge from under the skin, and share a revelation or a vision of what he has experienced. That might help locate a lost object. That might help come up with a potential practice for healing for someone who's suffering. And so these divination practices that are being engaged in by these indigenous prophets are being replicated by treasure seekers such as Joseph Smith, who are trying to use indigenous-like and biblical-like practices to conjure the dead and to access their treasures. The interesting thing that we find in the earliest accounts of Joseph Smith's treasure seeking is that Joseph Sr. is referencing the act of placing the seer stone under a skin rather than a hat. And that is, of course, key for historians like Don Bradley. They've argued that, or he's argued that Joseph Smith's own understanding of sticking a seer stone in a hat was probably more akin to sticking it under a skin to, in this way, replicate the practices of indigenous prophets like Handsome Lake. So that's what chapter 4 explores.
Before we get to that, I just want to say that this is really illuminating to me because your book has helped me sort of experience what it was like back in Joseph Smith's day to an extent I had not before. So we talk about View of the Hebrews, the book that was written, I think it's Ethan Smith, published, you know, in a different state, but not that far away. And Oliver Cowdery, and there's all this stuff about what's in it, what's not in it. Did Joseph Smith have access to it? You can't prove he had access to it. All this kind of stuff with a host of different books. But I think that from what you're saying, if I'm understanding it correctly, none of that matters because Joseph Smith didn't have to read this stuff. It was all around him.
Right. It wasn't only, he wasn't the only one doing these things. Right. It was kind of a meshing of indigenous and settler cultures, and kind of bringing together practices. And a lot of it was biblically framed because the settlers thought that maybe indigenous people, as Ethan Smith argued, were descendants of ancient Hebrews. And so they were often comparing indigenous traditions to those that they found in the Bible. And so the ones that in the way that Mormons tell the stories, we emphasize that biblical Urim and Thummim, but we don't talk about the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake and his divination techniques. We just emphasize the biblical aspects. And Joseph Smith himself started doing that in his lifetime. So it became a way of Christianizing or biblicizing, at least, these indigenous practices.
I'll just jump in here and just say, you know, you're mentioning like the seer stone in the leather pouch that it was carried in, and you mentioned indigenous people finding interesting looking rocks, shiny rocks, colorful rocks, translucent rocks. And at least of note, again, I think most of the audience will know this, but at least it should be of note, again, Joseph's first seer stone, when he alleged to have used Sally Chase's green seer stone, which also would have been quite interesting in color and shininess or translucentness. But for him to then go get his own seer stone, his first one, and it referred to it as a white translucent stone. But aside from that, this pouch that held the brown seer stone that's on the screen right now, we don't know if the translucent stone had its own pouch. We don't know that. We don't know if this pouch only carried this stone. Joseph seemed to have a favoritism towards various seer stones at various points in his life, in spite of often having more than one on hand at a time. It seemed like whatever one was his favorite didn't stay consistent. So who knows if this pouch was used for one of the other ones, including the white translucent one, which was certainly his favorite for a period of time in his life, or if it had its own pouch.
And who knows when the pouch was made.
Yeah. And, you know, and so many indigenous people, indigenous friends, still use medicine bags and stuff. These are still common. Vision quests are still common practices in Native communities. And so when they're encountering the Book of Mormon, and these stories, they're seeing those similarities. But those of us raised in a more of a settler worldview, we don't recognize these things as having connections to indigenous communities.
Just pointing out once again, we're not only talking about stories in the Book of Mormon, but we're talking about stories from church history in the way that Joseph Smith was called as a prophet, as a response to his vision quest, and the manner in which he translated the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And his treasure digging, which is aside from both of those.
Right. So how are we doing on time? We're an hour and a half in here.
We are great. I think we're great. Our numbers are swelling.
Oh, that's good to hear. Well, let me say, please go out and buy this book if you haven't already.
How can we do that, Tom?
You can pick it up at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City. You can get it at online booksellers, your favorite online booksellers. And please, if you're doing it through there, write a review of the book. I can use some good reviews in there. So please pick it up and read it for yourself, because I'm only touching on a few of the details. Each of these highlights is only a small part of what's in the book.
If there are any mistakes, are they the mistakes of men?
Indeed they are. I say that in the acknowledgments, I think it is, of one man in particular. And I found a few.
JC says they got a copy at Sunstone, and Dr. Murphy signed it.
Yeah, yes, I did. I signed quite a. Actually, they sold out Benchmarks there, so that was good. Thank you, all of you who came to purchase those. So chapter 5 is titled Origins, and it's very purposeful that I put Origins in the middle, because if you read a lot of scholarship about American history in general, Native Americans show up in the first chapter and then they disappear, right? They're part of the origins and they disappear for the rest of the narrative. And so I wanted to flip that around, put Origins in the middle. And I approach it quite differently than you'll see it has been approached in the past, because I'm looking at Origins in the context of how do Haudenosaunee tell their own origin stories. And I don't have that as my highlight here, but I go into some depth about the origin stories the Haudenosaunee tell. And there are some very surprising echoes and allusions to those stories in the Book of Mormon, including uses of the same names and characters. So there's some really fascinating similarities with those origin stories. But I also take a fresh look at the discussions of Israelite Hebrew connections and the white mound builder myth that is claiming that the mounds and other extravagant or evidences of civilization in ancient America were produced by white people rather than settlers. So I critique that. But as part of that critique, I also look especially at one particular character, Mordecai Noah. Mordecai Noah is represented here in the slide. He's a Jewish journalist, playwright, and very prominently known in Western New York. He's prominently known in Western New York, in fact, using the pen name Muley Mulick, which is a name that also ought to sound a little bit like the Book of Mormon. Mulick and Noah, King Noah in the Book of Mormon, are, again, types and shadows of this actual historical character, Mordecai M. Noah. So this journalist, dreamer, playwright, he imagines the creation of a city of refuge he calls Ararat. And you can see in the pictures, a picture of me with the the cornerstone of Ararat that he, in a big ceremony, would establish. And you can see Ararat, a sign on Grand Island in New York. His idea was that by purchasing a portion of Grand Island in New York, he could bring together Jews and indigenous Americans, even Black Jews, together to form this kind of Zionic city of refuge, where they could all come together and create this unified community. And so he's proposing this idea in very elaborate ceremonies. He's dressing up as, I think it was King George, and in a lot of Masonic symbolism. He was a Freemason as well, and he's proposing this elaborate scheme. It was a bigger dream than a reality, but this dream is replicated in the Book of Mormon in a lot of ways, one of which is in the representation of King Noah. So Mordecai Noah and King Noah both have this ambitious building plan for a city of refuge that's in between two Lamanite communities or two indigenous communities. So Grand Island is located between the Tuscarora and the Tonawanda Seneca reservations, just like King Noah's city is located between two Lamanite communities. They have this ostentatious, almost gaudy, like ambition of the great royal court that you see represented in the Book of Mormon narrative and in the pictures that we see in depictions of the Book of Mormon. I'm forgetting the name of the artist.
Freiberg,
yeah. And in the Book of Mormon account, you have King Noah is going to pay for his ambitious building plan by a
50%
tax.
Was it 1/5? It wasn't 50%. It's probably 1/5.
It was 1/5. Yeah,
that's bad enough,
basically. But really, Mordecai Noah's actual proposal was less than 1/10. It was, considered less than the biblical tithe. But you basically see again that exaggeration in the Book of Mormon. Mordecai Noah's efforts were pilloried and elaborated in Palmyra newspapers that Joseph Smith's father was subscribing to. And what you see is a strong correlation between the representations of Mordecai Noah in those local newspapers and King Noah in the Book of Mormon. Except again, the King Noah in the Book of Mormon is exaggerated and kind of made fun of to some degree. And I suspect, I from listening to John Turner on Mormon Stories, and he talks about Joseph Smith's love of mirth. I think a lot of these stories were probably because he was probably telling them before he ever dictated the Book of Mormon, right? According to his mother. It was probably a joke, people knew what he was referring to. King Noah is Mordecai Noah, and it's kind of like playing on it and kind of, mirth. It's funny, a way of making fun of this plan, but it's also not just making fun of it. The Book of Mormon is going to do it better, right? And so you get the Mulekites and the Zarahemlites, the Mulekites being another reference there. The Mulekites and the Nephites uniting, and I think it's playing out this vision that Mordecai Noah had. And so that chapter, one key feature of it is exploring those similarities and the differences.
Muli Mulak.
Yeah. Chapter 6 focuses on writing, and what what I want to emphasize as a highlight from this chapter is that Joseph Smith was not the first to produce a hieroglyphic scripture as an alternative to the Bible.
Now, this is fascinating.
Yeah, there were a number of indigenous prophets who did that before Joseph Smith did. Wangaman, the Assinnisinc prophet in the Susquehanna Valley in the 1750s, and Nealon, the Delaware prophet in the 1760s. They each produced these hieroglyphic charts that explicate their visions and then are replicated and on hide or on paper or on whatever material, bark, what materials that they had available to them. And then people would pay for them just like they would for the Book of Mormon, and then would treat them as these sacred books. And this image in the slide is John McCullough, who was a captive, a war captive, who observed one of these hieroglyphic texts and then reproduced it in his captivity narrative that he published, notably in 1808. Several decades after the events it described, but keeping this idea alive in the lifetime of Joseph Smith, that these hieroglyphic texts were being produced as these alternatives to the Bible. And so chapter 6 explores that. It also looks at some indigenous forms of writing, such as the wampum and Algonquic, which is some of the writings of Algonquian peoples. A lot of that would occur on bark and on trees, and would be called by the missionaries hieroglyphics because they were not a phonetic alphabet, but instead more of a pictographic representation.
What is represented in this chart, Tom?
Oh, so yeah, so I kind of like it's a vision that Nealon had, and so you can look at it astronomically in terms of kind of the indigenous ideas behind it. So on more of that indigenous idea, you can see the Milky Way represented there. This is the path of the ancestor, or the ancestors after they die.
Where's the Milky Way?
The Milky Way
yes,
is the stars and how they're separated in the sky, and you see these paths in the sky. So this was a very common Iroquois and Algonquian way of understanding what happens to us after we die, is that we travel through the stars, through the Milky Way. So you have that kind of indigenous representation there, but you also have mixed in there is the adoption of Christian ideas of a heaven-like path and a hell-like path. And here on this way to the heaven-like path are European vices, alcohol being preeminent among them. And in Nealon's case, he also emphasized the use of European trade goods, domestic animals, and plants. These were obstructions to being able to live that, or to have that heaven-like afterlife, that paradise sort of thing.
Who's the guy with the wings?
Oh, that's hell. Over here.
So that person there standing there, is that a demonic figure? Is that the devil?
Yeah.
So that would be a Christian borrowing?
Yes. Yeah. So like I say, it's this mixture of indigenous and Christian traditions. By the time that these prophets are very active, they've been proselytized by Christian missionaries for over a century. And it's important to recognize that indigenous traditions they are readily adaptable to change. To put it in Mormon terms, they believe in continuing revelation,
which and temporary commandments.
I think is also adopted by Joseph Smith from indigenous traditions.
What
So
is it that this reminds me of, like the charts that I see about the plan of salvation for Mormons?
right, yeah. I mean, because it's similar to the ways that missionaries would have been teaching the indigenous peoples using charts like this. And so with what visions and dreams allow indigenous prophets to do is introduce novel concepts, new ideas, to adapt to new challenges, to address change. And so using the use of dreams and visions makes native traditions much more flexible and adaptable than Christianity. And so one of the innovations of Mormonism is by replicating that indigenous idea of continuing revelation, we can create a tradition that's more adaptable than what the regular Christian denominations were experiencing.
We saw how long that lasted.
Yeah, well, such is life.
I guess that was a good try.
Yeah. Well, and I suspect, I mean, the church continues to change, though, isn't, I think sometimes I wonder if that change that we see in the church isn't a way to irritate all of us old folks that like to come on these podcasts and complain how the church used to be different than it is now.
It used to be true.
Right. But, they're just doing what all religious movements do. They're changing. So chapter 7 is entitled Curses. I think this might actually be the shortest chapter in the book, but what I look at here is the ideas in the Book of Mormon of theology of curses. And what's interesting is that these ideas were discussed by those prophets. The prophets often spoke in terms of the land being cursed by the use of domestic animals or European trade goods were causes of suffering from indigenous communities. Indigenous communities were suffering because of their use of these European crops and animals and technologies. And there's kind of like an ecological aspect to that. It certainly was true that hogs or pigs were uprooting the acorns and stuff that produced the food that native people were depending on. They were going through the clam beds and disrupting the clam beds, and they were causing considerable havoc ecologically in the community. So the prophets see that as like frame it in terms of a curse on the land, and curses were also being discussed in not just the prophetic movements, but in native Christian communities. And here's where the Moores Indian Charity School comes in particularly important. Is Moores Indian Charity School was founded by this man by the name of Eliezer Wheelock, who's represented in this image. And Eliezer Wheelock popularized among his students this idea that native people might be cursed. And it was partly because, he dedicated his life to proselytizing and converting native people. Yet time and time again, he would have this promising prospect of a native student like Samson Occam, for example, that shows all this promise and then turns against him, gets frustrated with him, or in his terms, backslided. And so he, in his moments of frustration, Eliezer Wheelock would say maybe natives are cursed. That instead of maybe recognizing that there was something wrong with his proselytizing or his own work, he would blame the native people themselves or this curse that's been placed upon them as the source of their what from his perspective were failures, maybe a return to their indigenous communities or traditions. And so that idea is embedded in the Book of Mormon's curse theology. But there's something really interesting about it, is that Eliezer Wheelock never associated that with skin color. Yet the Book of Mormon makes an association with skin color. And in Eliezer Wheelock's letters and those of his students back and forth between them, it was always speculative. It was like, well, maybe there's a curse, something like that. But the Book of Mormon takes this theological possibility and makes it the word of God. And not only does it say that these were curses, Native people are in fact cursed, but they're cursed with a black skin. And what's important about that is that Joseph Smith is drawing not now from the rhetoric about Native people, but instead of the rhetoric about Africans, people of black ancestry, who are based on colonial interpretations of Genesis 9 and 10. They're associating Noah and Ham and the curses associated with them. They're understanding that as being a dark skin. That's an idea that develops late in the colonial period. It's not in the original biblical texts. Okay. And this was well known in the 19th century. People knew that that kind of the more racist part of society was saying that black people are cursed with slave servitude, and that's why they are the slaves. But other people were contesting that and saying, no, it doesn't say that in the Bible. Well, what the Book of Mormon does is provide finally that scriptural reference that makes it very clear that a curse of a dark skin is scriptural. And so what you get is Joseph Smith is in many respects, his racism is more virulent than those people around him. And I think this is one point that I think Mormon apologists will have a little bit of trouble with my book. There's this desire among Mormon historians to paint Joseph Smith as if he was more progressive, because Brigham Young was even more racist than Joseph Smith. And I agree, Brigham Young was more racist, but Joseph Smith was not a progressive. When I look at him in relationship to his peers coming out of Moore's Indian Charity School, he is much more virulently racist than them, and bringing these interpretations of the Genesis stories of Noah and Ham and Cain into a scripture, a new scripture that provides a justification for racism in the Americas.
Does theorizing that the Native American population of the Americas came over from the Hebrews, right? View of the Hebrews, that they're Hebrew in origin. And does the idea that means that they are of a wider cast of skin, okay? Regardless of whether that's true. That's the idea, right? Doesn't that story almost necessarily need to account for some mechanism for a vast swath of that population to have their skin become much darker, and then have that population destroy the lighter skinned population, so that all you got left is the darker skinned?
I mean, I see what you're saying, but the reality is that the people coming from the Middle East would have been darker skinned than most Europeans, right? And so it isn't necessary. But where it is necessary, I guess, is in the racist ideas of the time, is that Native people were not civilized enough to have been able to create these evidences of civilization that were all around them. So if you believe that, and that's the white mound builder myth, right? That Dan Vogel has done so much work on, right? If you believe that idea, then you need to have the skin color change. But it doesn't flow from the biblical narrative because they wouldn't have been white.
I'm just talking about, well, look, Mormons today think Jesus was white as Thor. Okay, so I'm just guessing maybe they thought the same thing in Joseph Smith's day, that they had
and they get that from the Book of Mormon, right? And certainly, I mean, you can look at depictions of Jesus all around the world, and people tend to depict Jesus more like themselves. So that is a fairly common thing, but it doesn't flow from the biblical narrative, is it?
Right.
So chapter 8 looks at the missions themselves. And again, Moores Indian Charity School is that training ground for most of the missions to this area in the 18th, 19th centuries. And missions in the Book of Mormon resemble the understandings and the assumptions coming out of Moores Indian Charity School, and particularly the tendency, as I said, to associate civilization with Christianity. So the reason we have all the wrong plants and animals and technology in the Book of Mormon is because Joseph Smith and his contemporaries could not imagine Christianity existing without those what for them were signs of civilization. And so part of missionary work wasn't just teaching the Bible and the stories that are there, but it was teaching Native men how to plow, because Native agriculture was largely done by the women and was done using digging sticks rather than plows. And so missionaries would be teaching men how to do agriculture and how to use the plow. And of course, if you can use a plow, you need a domestic animal to pull that. You can do it as a person, but it's quite difficult, right? And so you get those beasts of burden like cattle and oxen and horses. And so the Book of Mormon's misrepresentation of Nephites as having these plants and animals and European technologies is in part a reflection of the missionary assumptions coming out of Moores Indian Charity School that assumed indigenous people couldn't have Christianity without having civilization, that the two of them were linked together.
Yes, almost in the same way that nowadays a lot of churches, maybe the Mormon church to some extent, links prosperity with the same thing.
Yeah.
With Christianity or belief or faith.
And a highlight from this chapter is, and this is discussed in multiple chapters, but there are these 7 Lamanite communities that in the Book of Mormon become the anti-Nephi Lehis and the people of Ammon. And they reflect the 7 Algonquian nations that were led by a Mohegan preacher by the name of Samson Occam, who was a native graduate of Moores, the first one, in fact. And they convert to Christianity and relocate to Oneida. So when the Book of Mormon events are happening at Oneida, it's these Algonquian communities. They were called Brothertown and Stockbridge, or New Stockbridge and Brothertown. And these were communities that very much resemble the people of Ammon and anti-Nephi Lehis that actually lived at Oneida just like they do in the Book of Mormon. And the person who led them was this man called Samson Occam. Joseph Johnson, another alumnus of Moores Indian Charity School, was also a key missionary in helping them relocate from the eastern seaboard to Oneida territory. And the Book of Mormon not only has those communities, it has Samson Occam himself kind of replicated in a character that has a similar name, Samuel the Lamanite. And of course, Samuel the Lamanite not only has a similar name, he's preaching similar messages to Samson Occam. He's just like Samson Occam traveled to England and Scotland, where he had stones thrown at him, and he had a kind of metaphorical arrows, right? And was mistreated in person and in the press. There, you have Samuel the Lamanite represented in the Book of Mormon, similarly as getting up on the walls of Zarahemla and having stones thrown at him. And so you have something very similar to the story of Samson Occam in Samuel the Lamanite. Samson Occam was also very important because he was that first native convert to come out of Moores Charity School. And when he traveled to Scotland and England, he was doing fundraising for a charity fund to support Moores School, Moores Academy. And what happened afterwards is that Eliezer Wheelock, who we met in that last chapter, he took those funds, and instead of supporting Native students, he began to bring in more and more white students, more and more settler students into the school. And Samson Malcolm was frustrated with him, wrote a really strongly worded letter about his misuse of the funds and how all this suffering that Samson Malcolm had experienced was for naught, because Wheelock was using this money to create Dartmouth College and to fund non-Native students to come to Moores in Dartmouth. And among those would eventually be Hiram Smith.
When you
Right?
put all this together, the whole idea of doing the Christian missionary effort among the Native Americans who are right there, and a lot of them have converted and they're at Dartmouth and they're trying to convert more, and all this kind of stuff that's going on. And the Book of Mormon itself having these major missions to the Lamanites, right? And the entire book is written for the purpose of converting the Lamanites to Christianity, the Native Americans to Christianity. I would say that by number 8, based upon my thorough understanding of apologetic evidence for the Book of Mormon, that you have now cleared the bar. You're head and shoulders above the evidence that apologists have to put the Book of Mormon as 2,000 years old.
Yeah. Well, and there's another character too. My colleague Angelo Baca, this Dene and Hopi anthropologist, has argued that Samuel the Lamanite looks a lot to him like William Apis. And William Apis was another missionary who also was an itinerant minister in Western New York and throughout New England as well. But during Joseph Smith's lifetime. So Samson Occam was kind of somebody of the past, and William Apis was of the present. And in fact, so Samuel the Lamanite has some characteristics similar to William Apis too. And interestingly, Mormon missionaries would actually try to convert William Apis later. So he's featured here as well. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 gets to the great climax of the Book of Mormon. And this is probably the most obvious of the adaptations of Haudenosaunee tradition in the Book of Mormon, besides those place names, and that is the narrative of the Great Peace. And so what I was really curious about is how did we get those stories together into the Book of Mormon? And so I went back through the historical record of what are the different variations of the Great Peace narrative, because this is one of the great epics of Haudenosaunee oral tradition. There's the Epic of Creation, there's the Epic of Confederation, and then there's the Epic of Handsome Lake. And so this Epic of Confederation is the one that tells the story of the Great Peace, and is really well known from later sources. But I want to know, well, how would that be in the Book of Mormon in the 1820s? And so that's going back through the historical record. I found a book that others had speculated had also had an influence on the Book of Mormon, and that is David Cusick's Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations. And you have a depiction of it here. And interestingly, the historian Dale Morgan, in an unpublished manuscript, or at least it wasn't published during his lifetime or by him, he was writing this great epic history of Mormonism. And he postulated in one of his manuscripts that there was a key catalyst, the catalytic agent, he called it, for the Book of Mormon that inspired Joseph Smith to produce an ancient history, was in fact David Cusick's Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations, which was advertised in the Canandaigua newspaper in 1827. And you see pictured here that advertisement from the 1827 newspaper. And so Dale Morgan speculated that that was that catalytic agent inspiring the Book of Mormon. And there are a striking number of parallels between the Book of Mormon and David Cusick's book. But it is important to say that he doesn't just take David Cusick's stories and replicate them. It's more like the way he uses the Bible. There are echoes and allusions to these stories. It's not a plagiarized copy of this story. So if that's what you're looking for, you're not going to find that in David Cusick. You're not going to find it anywhere, actually, in the ancient world or 19th century America. You're not going to find a text very much like the Book of Mormon. What I see Joseph Smith doing is kind of drawing from a lot of different stimuli in his 19th century cultural environment and pulling that together into something novel. And that something novel includes echoes and allusions to Haudenosaunee oral tradition, such as that found in David Cusick's sketches, and echoes and allusions to the Bible, echoes and allusions to Adam Clarke's Bible commentary, and of course to the Christian debates of the day about infant baptism and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Those sorts of things are all echoes and allusions that he's putting back into the ancient past. And among those is the story of the Great Peace. You see a couple of early variants of that story in David Cusick. And what makes David Cusick particularly interesting compared to the older stories, because if the Great Peace was actually a Christ visit to ancient America, then what you would find, the older the stories are, you would expect them to be more similar to the Book of Mormon. But what we find is the earliest stories, the key characters in the forming of the Great Peace, known as Tekanawita or Ayandwatha or Tararajo, these characters are represented as, and the Mother of Nations, I should add, these characters are presented as ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things, but they were ordinary people. And over time, it becomes more miraculous, that the stories become more elaborate. They become more mythic over time. And my colleague Darren Bonaparte, that I mentioned earlier, that Mohawk scholar, he describes this as a living history that's kind of evolving over time. And what we see is that the Book of Mormon's account is not like those earliest ones, but instead very much like the ones found in 1820s Western New York. Because Sketches of the Ancient History of Six Nations was published in Lewiston, New York. David Cusick was marketing it all along the Erie Canal, along with his art and that of his brother. You can see some of his art here, where you see Ayandwatha and Tekanawita and Taradaho represented as creating that Great Peace. And so this, I think, was either very much like Joseph Smith's source, or it was his actual source. You know, he may have encountered it in writing. He may have talked to the Cusick brothers directly if he purchased this from them, or may have seen it in the bookstore, or may have just seen the newspaper advertisement and heard other people talking about the story. Or he heard it from other versions, and that's where I get into in chapter 10, Peacemaker. And this kind of follows the Haudenosaunee oral traditions as they are recorded in the historical record after 1830. And there's interestingly one account recorded in 1845 that's even more similar to the Book of Mormon. And this account is an Onondaga account, and published by Arthur Clarke, and then later by Henry Schoolcraft, or actually the other way around. Henry Schoolcraft published it first, and then Arthur Clarke later. And this account has kind of more of the Jesus or the Peacemaker coming in more of this majestic descent and ascent that you see in the Book of Mormon. You don't see that in David Cusick, but you do see it in Arthur Clarke's Onondaga account. And so it's possible, as the as the Haudenosaunee oral tradition suggests, that Joseph Smith actually obtained these stories for orally and not in a written form. And so I want to keep that possibility open by following those sources. I also look at how did those sources evolve over time. That actually some of the parallels that between the Book of Mormon accounts and the Great Peace get more alike, and that's some things like you don't see a reference to virgin birth, for example, or of a messenger telling the mother of the peacemaker of the significance that he would play. These aspects don't come into the written record of Haudenosaunee oral tradition until the late 19th century. So it's possible Joseph Smith heard a version that was not recorded until much later, but it's also possible that both the Haudenosaunee oral tradition and the Book of Mormon are alluding to the same biblical parallels. And so that they're both referencing in the case I mentioned to Matthew. And in the New Testament is the same source for those similarities in both cases.
Maybe could the oral tradition be influenced by the Book of Mormon itself?
Yeah, and that possibility is Haudenosaunee that it could have gone back the other direction. I didn't find evidence for that because a lot of these changes really occurred in places where Mormon missionaries were not active in the times that they first appeared, and they also appeared in reference to local events, things that were happening on the Grand River Reserve in Ontario, and that's where they're first appearing. So, and I don't think that the Mormon influence went the Mormons influenced the Haudenosaunee tradition, although I can't rule that out. And one of the places that is worth deeper digging, so I'm highlighting it here, and that is the similarities with the Cayugas. So today there are a lot of Cayuga Mormons, and the Cayugas also have traditions that are quite similar to the Book of Mormon, and especially in the representations of Jesus as one of the four sacred beings, and having the other three sacred beings that represent the Book of Mormon as those three disciples who we call the three Nephites. That's a key component that's emphasized in both the Cayuga traditions and is present in the Book of Mormon, but you don't see it. You don't see that connection being made, even though to me it's rather explicit in the Book of Mormon that there's an etiology of the Handsome Lake's three disciples in the Book of Mormon. But the Cayuga traditions are quite fascinating in their similarities. And so pictured here is the Cayuga Longhouse at Six Nations Grand River Reserve in Ontario. And here is the Jake Thomas Learning Center. Jake Thomas was one of the key orators in the 20th century and early 21st century, or late 20th century anyway, who shared a lot of these stories, translated them to English for the first time. Because that's the interesting thing, is a lot of these stories weren't translated into English either. So it just raises lots of questions. And this chapter is my best effort to try to make sense out of it with the knowledge I have at this point in time. But for those who want to dig into this stuff deeper, to follow up on my scholarship, there's a trail for you to follow here to dig in deeper.
Great. How do we get the book again, Tom?
It's available at your major online booksellers and at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake. And please, go to your local bookstore and ask for it. If they don't have it, they'll order it for you. And it'll help get it on the shelf for me.
Great idea. That book again is Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois, and the Book of Mormon by Thomas W. Murphy.
Yeah, and we're over 2 hours, so I'm at my conclusion. You've got a couple of slides here. After
no, I've already given up on my slides ages ago, but this is going to be a great conclusion to a great show.
Do you mind if I just say something really quick, you two?
Yeah.
So going back to your chapter 9, again, you come up with the phrase sort of whites is an ite,
Mhm.
and you talk about the Great Peace, and you have this, you're referring to these Native American, these indigenous stories, uh, where a character, a historical figure, creates this great lasting peace among these warring nations. And I'm just trying to sort of draw a connection for the viewers who are watching, but you're pointing to the Book of Mormon and you're going like, look at Third Nephi, look at Fourth Nephi. Notice when Christ comes that he is resolving the same sort of issue,
Mhm.
but he's doing it in a different way. And the way he's doing it is wanting, again, the way the scripture reads out is that there aren't any Lamanites, there are no ites, uh, but it ignores the fact that by getting everybody to play nice in the sandbox, everybody taking on the color of whiteness, that is its own ite unto itself. And hence, sort of in Joseph Smith's mind, having everybody be Caucasian and righteous, in his mind, sort of eliminates any of the ites. But as you note, it still leaves one ethnicity behind.
Right. And that's that theology of whiteness that just pervades the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
So I conclude by going back to something I discussed earlier in the book, and that is the tendency of Mormons to dig up indigenous graves as a way of looking on and archaeological sites as a way of looking for validation for the Book of Mormon. That began with that Zelph account with Joseph Smith, right? And today that practice is not over, because Brigham Young University still has at least 81 human remains in its collection that it acknowledges are present of indigenous peoples that are still there. So the book ends with a call for returning these ancestors to their descendants. We have no need for taking those indigenous people from their graves. The Book of Mormon is not about them. It's about 18th, 19th century Western New York and New England. So that is a call for that. And then I want to just, to wrap this up, come back to those terms Onondaga and Oneida. These are actual people, real places, who have stories of their own. And what I would like to encourage listeners to do, not just read my book, but go to these communities or their books that I reference and cite in my book. Read their stories for themselves. And I mentioned at Onondaga, there's the Great Law of Peace Center. It's in part of Onondaga Lake State, or near Onondaga Lake State Park. And there you can see inside the representations of the peacemaker narrative in their own words. And at the Oneida Cultural Center in Oneida, New York, you can hear the stories of also of the peacemaker. You can also hear their stories of feeding of Oneida's feeding Washington's troops at Valley Forge. That's very similar to a Book of Mormon narrative about the Oneidas that appears to be the first historical record, at least if read allegorically, of Oneidas feeding the troops at Valley Forge. If you see Captain Moroni as analogous to George Washington. So you can see these same stories represented in their terms. And what I really want to encourage you to do is hear in their words and give them the same type of credence that you would others. And this is a representation from that Great Law Peace Center of the Peacemaker's Journey. And we will skip because we're out of time, we'll skip the
That's what he's paddling the white stone canoe, right?
Yeah, well, what I'll say is there are some similarities and differences. So what I will say is, in these stories, as you'll see represented at the Great Law Peace Center, you'll see the Mother of Nations represented, who's left out of the Book of Mormon narratives. And even though the Mother of Nation was in David Cusick's account, the story wasn't closely related to the Great Peace, so Joseph Smith probably didn't see the connection. But the Mother of Nations that plays a key role in later renditions, she's represented there. The Great Stone Canoe is represented. That doesn't appear in Cusick either, but it does appear in that later 1845 account where the peacemakers descending out of the sky in a white stone canoe. And in more of the traditions, he's coming across the water in white stone canoe.
It kind of makes more sense.
Lake Ontario in particular, right, or Onondaga Lake in some of the accounts.
You know why Joseph Smith left the Mother of Nations out of the Book of Mormon, Tom?
He left all the women out of the Book of Mormon almost.
Because it was already getting kind of long, It was getting long already.
Yeah, so I had all these aspirations for a Q&A. I probably ruined that chances by talking too much here.
I don't know. Hey, we've been Qing and Aing all the way along. Bill and I have. Do you want to see if there's anybody out there who wants to ask Dr. Thomas Murphy any questions about his presentation, his book, or make any comments?
So I put the link in the live chat, folks. If you want to quickly click that and come into the live chat, if you've got comments or questions for Dr. Thomas Murphy, that would be incredible. Yeah, so we can wait a second and see if sort of that happens. One thing I wanted to at least ask, maybe just to buy a minute, this idea of Cusick and Joseph Smith is, do you see, maybe explain why you see the likelihood that one is relying off the other rather than they're both independently sort of Christianizing Native American traditions, maybe separately, but doing it in a similar way, that you see overlap where potentially there really isn't? They're coming to a conclusion from completely different places. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really difficult thing to separate out, right? Is I think an important acknowledgement is that I can't always tell the difference between when it's part of a larger cultural phenomenon of the kind of the similarities in that broad scale, and when it's more of a direct borrowing. What I think the strongest evidence for a direct borrowing is coming from the Haudenosaunee oral tradition itself. That's what they're saying. And so much of what they're saying is substantiated by other aspects of the historical record that I think we can't just dismiss that out of hand. And so I think listening to the native voices, I think is critical here. But there are some clues that suggest the oral tradition is that the Book of Mormon has the earliest historical reference to a number of details in these Haudenosaunee oral traditions. So they're recorded in the Book of Mormon before they're recorded elsewhere. And so that suggests that Joseph Smith had more than written materials available to him. But there are counter arguments, counter things. So let's say David Cusick, for example. With David Cusick, as he told it orally, according to people who visited with him in the 1820s, he corrected a mistake that was in the book. Okay. And so that mistake was a reference to the quees, which is a Tuscarora word for pigs. And in his book, he references them as mammoths. And so the Book of Mormon takes the mammoth route. And so it, has elephants, is the term the Book of Mormon has, and curulums and cumans, right? So of course, it's still possible that both Cusick and Joseph Smith were influenced by larger narratives about the finding of mammoths and mastodons and elephant-like creatures. That's possible, but it's also suggested that maybe there was a direct borrowing in this case from Cusick's written material rather than his oral material, because testimony from that time suggests orally he was correcting his mistake in the book.
So now, not only are tapirs horses, pigs are mammoths.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the quees is behaving very much like pigs too. So rutting up and ravaging communities, and so it's very pig-like in its behavior in the book too.
So nobody's down below.
But then mammoths might have done that too. Who knows?
Yes, those mammoths, they can be quite porcine on occasion.
Yeah. Nobody's down below, but somebody did have a good question in the chat. Again, I'm not going to pronounce the word right, Thomas, so maybe if you can read the question and then answer it.
So the question was, what was the Haudenosaunee education system like for ages 6 through 18 during the time of Joseph Smith? So there's different ways to answer that question, because the Haudenosaunee, they didn't have like a formal educational system like the Christian schools outside of the Christian schools themselves. So a lot of the Haudenosaunee children did attend Christian schools that were run usually by missionaries. So there was a participation in the colonial schools, and those schools were often, like Moore's Indian Charity School, was focused on educating natives, but they also had their own systems of apprenticeship, of learning, that were less structured, but equally informative in developing their own understanding. And so storytelling, for example, was a very big part of that, especially in the winter, in the longhouses. And women in particular, the clan mothers, would play a key role in such things as helping dreamers and visionaries to understand their dreams and vision experiences. And so both in ceremony and in everyday life, the clan mothers would be the interpreters of those dreams, if you will, or at least help the dreamer through that process of interpretation. And you actually ironically see that in the Book of Mormon, when there's this contest between Lehi and Sariah to understand his dream. But the Book of Mormon dismisses Sariah's account, and that's very anti-Haudenosaunee. That's like, no, that's improper. That's the wrong way to do it. You want to listen to the clan mothers, because they have a much better understanding. And one of the things that the clan mothers would emphasize is the way that your dreams and visions reflect your own wishes, your own fears, very much kind of like a psychology of dreams. Mm-hmm. And so that was ritualized and just part of everyday interactions. There's a ceremonial cycle as well that is part of that education. Yeah, go ahead with the question, though.
Speaking about the education on visions and not about the gender, there's also the moment when Nephi, who sees the same vision as his dad, takes the time to correct his dad and say his dad got the vision wrong. Now, that doesn't seem really helpful to his dad to understand the meaning of his vision for him. It sounds much more like there's only one version of this damn thing, and mine's the right one.
Well, and it's a way for Joseph Smith to assert authority over Joseph Smith Jr. to assert authority over Joseph Smith Sr., whose vision is very much like Lehi's. So it's a way of actually he does this with he's correcting everybody else, right? And it's almost without exception in a self-serving way. And so that, at least to me, is just blatantly obvious in the Book of Mormon. It's like, come on, this Nephi character is self-aggrandizing. I mean,
do you see him as clearly Joseph Smith?
Do I see
Nephi?
Nephi? Oh, I think, yeah, he's a projection of his own self. Yeah. And and Dan Vogel's that does really great work in showing how the Joseph Smith family dynamics. And I should mention my good friend Robert Anderson, who wrote a book about this as well many years ago, and showing how Joseph Smith's family dynamics shaped the narrative of the Book of Mormon and is reflected there. And what I'm doing is kind of extending that out from saying, yeah, the family dynamics are important, but so too are these greater social networks, and that particularly that social network of Moore's Charity School and the Native communities that were coming together with settler communities through that venue is part of that greater social world that the Book of Mormon was participating in.
Which is just down the road a few miles from where Joseph Smith was growing up as a kid.
Right.
Wow. All right. Well, anything you want to say here in conclusion, Dr. Murphy? This has been great. We've really appreciated your coming on to tell us about the exciting research that's in your book.
Well, thank you, RFM and Bill Reel, for inviting me back to share this. And thank you to the listeners that have stuck with us. And please do go out, get a copy of my book. But I also recommend making sure you're getting those native sources too. Don't just support settler scholars like myself. My good friend Elise Boxer has an excellent new book out called Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite. That's a great book to read alongside mine because we draw upon similar theoretical frameworks in our books. And if you really want to dive into the Haudenosaunee materials, I recommend that book mentioned on the back by my friend Darren Bonaparte, his book Creation and Confederation. That is a great outline of kind of the way that the great peace narratives evolve over time, and the way that Haudenosaunee people in particular have shaped those narratives. So those are kind of two key native authors I would recommend people take a look at alongside my writing. So please support them as well.
Okay, really good. Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas W. Murphy. The book is Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois, and the Book of Mormon. Get it today. And thank you so much. By the way, before you go away, please hit like, please hit subscribe. Thank you to everybody who's donated at mormonismlive.org. Please, if you haven't, go there today. It is mormonismlive.org, right, Bill? Okay, I want to make sure I get that right. And just make a donation today. You'll feel better about yourself. Support the show. Be a part of the team. Keep things moving in the right direction. Thanks again for everything. Everybody out there, and you too, Dr. Murphy. Thanks once again. We'll see you later, and we'll see the rest of you next week on Wednesday for another episode of Mormonism Live. Good night.